On the day America gained a new president in 1945, one man already held enough secrets inside Washington to make any leader think twice about crossing him. April 12, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt is gone. Harry Truman, shocked, grieving, unprepared, is suddenly the most powerful man on earth. He walks into the Oval Office, knowing he must rebuild a government crafted by a giant. And he wastes no time doing it. Roosevelt's allies are dismissed, moved aside, or quietly replaced as Truman works to build an administration that reflects his own instincts, not the legacy of the man before him. Yet in the center of this political earthquake, one figure remains untouched. One man Truman doesn't even attempt to shove aside. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Why did Truman leave him alone when nearly every other Roosevelt-era power broker was shown the door? And what made Hoover so uniquely untouchable? The answer is far more unsettling than most Americans realize. To understand why Truman stepped lightly, we must look at the Hoover he inherited, a Hoover already transformed into something more than a public servant. A man who built power by capturing information, fear, and loyalty in equal measure. Hoover joined the Justice Department in 1917, straight out of law school, relentless and hungry for authority. During the first Red Scare, he orchestrated sweeping raids against suspected radicals. Warrants, due process, clear evidence. These were obstacles to bulldoze. What mattered was the appearance of control, and Hoover delivered results with ruthless precision. By 29, he was running the organization that would become the FBI. And once he had the wheel, he made sure he would never have to give it back. Over the next 2 decades, Hoover reshaped the Bureau into his own fortress. Agents weren't only loyal to the mission. They were loyal to him personally. He cultivated friendly journalists, shaped the FBI's public mythology, and built an image of the Bureau as America's incorruptible shield. Hollywood embraced him. Radio dramas glorified him, but that was just the version the public saw. Behind the curtain, Hoover was constructing something far more dangerous. Sprawling secret files on thousands of Americans, from activists to senators, from journalists to Supreme Court justices. Hoover understood a truth most politicians of the 1930s and 40s had not yet grasped. Knowledge is power, and private knowledge is leverage. Franklin Roosevelt, politically brilliant and experienced, knew he needed Hoover's intelligence during the Depression and World War II. But Roosevelt also understood Hoover's ambitions and kept him on a tight leash, meeting with him often and maintaining a careful balance of power. Truman inherited the man, but not the relationship. Picture Truman walking into his first meeting with Hoover. On one side, a new president who never expected to be in that position. On the other, a bureaucratic titan who had already outlasted multiple administrations and quietly amassed vaults filled with sensitive information. Each man understood the implications instantly. No threats needed to be spoken aloud. What do you do when you become president and realize that someone inside your own government may know more about your vulnerabilities than you do? Hoover had spent years studying the political machine that launched Truman's early career. The Pendergast organization in Kansas City, corrupt, feared, and ultimately dismantled by Hoover's FBI, left behind a long trail of documents, testimonies, and whispered allegations. Truman himself wasn't corrupt, but he operated within that machine, cast the votes expected of him, and benefited from its political muscle. Hoover's files documented all of it. Enough to embarrass Truman. Enough to raise uncomfortable questions. Enough to be weaponized if needed. Hoover didn't have to say, "I have a file on you." His reputation did the speaking, and the files rarely stopped at politics. Truman enjoyed poker nights, colorful language, and good bourbon. Harmless today, potentially career-fracturing. In 1945, Hoover collected that kind of information the way a spider spins a Web quietly, methodically, always prepared for the moment when the prey might struggle. Truman made a choice. He would not challenge Hoover early in his presidency. Not when he was still proving he belonged in the office. Not when the FBI director could destabilize his administration. With a single well-timed whisper, he dismissed high-ranking Roosevelt loyalists. But Hoover stayed, because the others had influence. Hoover had information. And information was infinitely more dangerous. If you were Truman, would you risk creating an enemy like that? Truman wasn't blind. He knew Hoover's public image, America's guardian, the fearless nemesis of gangsters, saboteurs, and spies. The public adored him. Movies portrayed the FBI as unstoppable. Newspapers showered him with praise. Any president who dared fire, Hoover risked looking guilty as if he had something to hide. Truman's hands were tied politically and publicly. Hoover wasn't simply an official. He was an institution. Yet Truman made one decisive move. He refused to let Hoover seize control of foreign intelligence. In 1947, as the Cold War began, Truman approved the creation of the CIA. Hoover wanted that territory. He wanted every branch of intelligence, domestic and international, under his command. Truman, wary of Hoover's thirst for unchecked authority, quietly blocked him. This was their closest collision. Hoover reaching outward for global power, Truman shutting the door. But Truman didn't weaken Hoover's domestic empire. He simply prevented its expansion. Their relationship remained cool, professional, and saturated with unspoken tension. Then came the 1948 election, a political battle. Truman was expected to lose in a landslide. Thomas Dewey seemed unbeatable. Pollsters wrote Truman off. Newspapers mocked his chances. And suddenly, fragments of Truman's early, Pendergast associations began resurfacing at suspiciously perfect moments. Old testimonies, photographs, whispered reminders of political debts. The information wasn't new, but its timing was strategic. Could some of it have been nudged into the press by Hoover's FBI? We can't prove it, but we know Hoover had done this to others. He preferred targeted leaks, never enough to destroy, just enough to unsettle. Enough to remind a politician who held the real power. And Truman, seasoned and perceptive, would have recognized the signal. Yet he fought, campaigned relentlessly, and achieved one of the greatest upsets in American history. His victory shocked the nation. For a moment, Truman stood taller than ever, finally elected on his own terms. But elections don't erase secrets. Hoover's file still existed. His influence remained untouched. Truman still didn't fire him. He didn't even test the idea. Because Hoover could retaliate in ways that were invisible, untraceable, and politically lethal. By the early Cold War, Hoover's power only expanded. Anti-communist panic spread like wildfire. Politicians begged for intel, proving they were protecting the nation. Hoover seized the moment with surgical precision. He quietly fed Senator Joseph McCarthy fragments of raw intelligence, often exaggerated or unverified. McCarthy turned that information into a weapon, launching his brutal crusade against alleged communist infiltration. Innocent lives were shattered. Diplomat, artist, professor, it didn't matter. Truman despised McCarthy's tactics. But cutting off McCarthy's information flow meant challenging the man who controlled it. And that man was Hoover. How do you stop a demagogue when the gatekeeper of intelligence is pouring fuel on the fire? Meanwhile, Hoover expanded something even more alarming. Covert operations against political groups, civil rights leaders, labor organizers, and anyone he considered a threat. These weren't investigations. They were manipulations. Anonymous letters, psychological disruption, infiltration. The earliest seeds of what would become COINTELPRO. Truman may not have seen the full scope. Hoover was too calculated for that. But he saw enough to be uneasy. And still, he held back. Because exposing Hoover meant confronting Hoover. And confronting someone with a vault of national secrets was a risk. Truman judged too great. There's a famous line attributed to Truman, perhaps a myth, but deeply true in spirit. I'd rather have him inside the tent than outside throwing stones. Whether he said it exactly or not doesn't matter. The meaning fits perfectly. Keeping Hoover close was risky. Pushing him out could have been catastrophic. By the time Truman left office in 1953, Hoover had been FBI director longer than most Americans had been alive. And the bureau he built answered first and foremost to him, not to Congress, not to the courts, and not fully to any president. Eisenhower didn't challenge him. Kennedy didn't fire him. Johnson kept him close. Even Nixon, who later abused presidential power in his own ways, kept Hoover untouched. Because they understood what Truman learned immediately. You don't pick a fight with the man who holds the master key to everyone's secrets. In the decades that followed, Hoover wielded influence like a silent monarch. He monitored civil rights leaders, spied on anti-war activists, and targeted political voices he disliked. Fear kept Washington compliant, and in many ways, it all traces back to Truman's decision not to remove him, setting the precedent that Hoover was untouchable. Once that belief took hold, it shaped nearly half a century of American political life. Truman wasn't a coward. He made courageous decisions, some of the hardest in U.S. history. He fired General Douglas MacArthur, a national hero, because MacArthur defied civilian authority. Truman's popularity collapsed. His reputation took a beating. But he did it because the principle mattered. Yet when confronted with Hoover, the man quietly corroding democratic norms from inside the system, Truman chose caution. He looked at the political landscape, looked at the man across the table with decades of classified files, and decided that survival his own and the stability of his administration came first. It was a compromise he likely knew was wrong, but he made it anyway. Fear is the quiet architect of unchecked power. A secret kept in darkness can guide the fate of a nation in daylight. In the end, Hoover stayed. The FBI's culture hardened around his vision. And Truman's presidency, for all its triumphs, carried the burden of that one decision. Because it wasn't just about Truman. It was about every leader who followed. Every decision shaped in Hoover's shadow. Every moment when fear outweighed accountability. Hoover didn't endure because presidents admired him. He endured because presidents feared him. And as long as fear defined the limits of authority, the man who mastered information could shape the most powerful office in the world. If you learned something new, hit like to help more people discover stories like this. And support Winds of Thought so we can keep exploring the hidden layers of history.